Folks, welcome to Cowboy Ironheart, where we spin those deep, soul-stirring Western romances that remind us love finds a way even in the hardest frontier days. Today, Moat V got a special one for you called You Are Worthy, a tale of sharing the rain, the giant cowboy, and the forsaken widow. Picture this, friends. The year is Motnin Tom Tomli Lam, up in the rugged Montana territory. Rain was hammering down like the heavens themselves had split open, turning the dirt streets of Willow Creek into a muddy river. Evelina stood there under the narrow overhang of the general store porch, her dark blue dress already soaked at the hem, clutching her small carpet bag like it was the only thing anchoring her to this world. She had come all this way as a mail-order bride, heart full of desperate hope, only to learn upon arrival that the man who'd sent for her lay buried in the town cemetery after a horse threw him. Now she was forsaken, whispers following her about how her soft, full figure didn't suit the hard life out here. That S, when he appeared through the downpour, a massive silhouette that seemed to part the rain itself. Garrick, the giant cowboy from the mountain homestead, his broad shoulders cutting through the storm as he made for shelter. He ducked under that same porch, and suddenly the space felt impossibly small. Their eyes met, and in that moment something shifted in the air between them. Little did she know, this towering man was about to speak words that would begin to heal her broken heart. Now, if you already feeling that tug at moat for your heartstrings from the way those two souls found Zehat to other in the storm, well, friends, Moda sure appreciate it if you hit that like button and subscribe to Cowboy Ironheart. It helps us keep bringing these heartfelt Western tales to life for folks like you who love a good, slow-burn romance with real depth and those quiet moments that stick with you long after the credits roll. The rain kept pounding down like it meant to wash the whole world clean, sheets of it drumming on the tin roof overhead and turning the street into a slick ribbon of mud. Under that narrow porch, Evelina felt the cool damp seeping into her bones, but the giant man who had stepped in beside her changed everything in an instant. Garrick stood there, water dripping from the brim of his hat onto those massive shoulders, and even hunched a little to fit the space he still filled it completely. His storm-gray eyes met hers again, steady and kind, and she realized with a start that she wasn't afraid. Not the way she had been when the stagecoach dropped her off 2 weeks ago, alone and unwanted in a town that sized her up and found her lacking. He shifted his weight, the old floorboards creaking under him, and said real soft that he hoped she didn't mind sharing the shelter shimmer. Said the storm had come up fast and caught more than one person off guard today. Evelina swallowed hard, her fingers tightening on the handle of her carpet bag, and told him she was thankful for the company, that she hadn't expected the skies to open quite like this on her walk back from the livery. Her voice came out quieter than she meant it to, carrying that gentle lilt from back east where life had once been simpler before everything fell apart. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, aware of how her full figure filled out the damp calico dress, the way the fabric clung now after the first heavy drops had found her. In a town like Willow Creek, where the women were expected to be wiry and tough as rawhide, she had learned fast that her soft curves made her stand out in all the wrong ways. Garrick didn't seem to notice the rain anymore. He leaned one broad shoulder against the post, careful not to crowd her, and asked if she was new in town. The question was simple, spoken in that deep, rumbling voice that felt like warm thunder rolling across the prairie, but it opened something inside her. She nodded and explained how she had come all the way from Pennsylvania as a mail-order bride, letters full of hope and promises from a man named Harlan, who swore he needed a steady hand and a kind heart on his small spread. Only when she stepped off the stage, carpetbag in hand and heart pounding with nervous excitement, the sheriff had met her with the bad news. Harlan had been thrown from his horse 3 weeks earlier, gone before she ever arrived. Forsaken, that's what the whispers called her now. A widow before she was ever a wife. No family back home to return to, no money for the fare, just the hard truth that the frontier didn't make room for a woman like her. She stopped talking, the words catching in her throat as the rain roared on. Garrick listened without interrupting, his big hands resting loose at his sides, those calloused fingers that could snap a rope or gentle a spooked colt now still as stone. He looked down at her, all 6'8" of him, and there was no pity in those storm-gray eyes, only a quiet understanding that made her breath hitch. He said he knew a thing or two about loss himself. Told her how his own folks had been taken by a fever that swept through the high country years back, leaving him with nothing but the mountain homestead, and a silence that sometimes felt louder than any storm. Said the territory could be cruel to those who didn't fit the mold, but that didn't mean they were broken, not one bit. Evelina felt her heart stutter at the kindness in his tone. She had spent the last 2 weeks taking in laundry and mending at the boarding house, enduring the sideways glances from the shopkeepers' wives who clucked about how a woman of her size would never last a winter out here. Yet here was this giant cowboy, built like the mountains he came from, speaking to her like she mattered. The space between them felt charged now, the rain creating a private curtain that shut out the rest of Willow Creek. She could smell the wet wool of his coat mixed with wood smoke and leather, the clean scent of a man who worked hard and lived honest. His presence was so solid, so reassuring, that for the first time since stepping off that stage, she didn't feel quite so adrift. He shifted again, closer this time but still respectful, and the hem of his long duster brushed her skirt. She didn't pull away. Instead, she looked up at him, those hazel eyes of hers searching his face, and asked what had brought him down from the mountain today. Garrick's mouth curved in the faintest smile, the kind that softened the rugged lines of his diavakep beneath that neatly trimmed beard. He said supplies mostly. Flour, nails, a new axe head because the old one had finally given up after too many cords of wood. But the storm had caught him too, and now he was glad of it. Glad because it had led him, right here, under this porch, standing beside a woman who looked like she carried the weight of the world and still held her chin high. The words hung there between them, warm against the chill. Evelina felt a flutter low in her belly, something she hadn't felt in years, not since her first husband had passed and left her with nothing but debts and memories. She told him she appreciated the kindness, that most folks in town had been quick to look the other way, or offer only the barest scraps of work. Garrick's eyes darkened with something protective, almost fierce, and he said that was their loss. Said the town had thin standards, always chasing after the willowy girls who could ride like boys and never complained about the wind or the work. But he saw different. He saw a woman whose beauty ran deeper than any of that, a beauty that came from the way her eyes held quiet strength even when life had tried to break her. He said, voice dropping lower, that her softness, her curves, the gentle way she carried herself, it was far superior to anything the town called pretty. Superior because it was real, honest, made for enduring the long winters and the hard days with a heart that didn't quit. Evelina's breath caught sharp. No one had ever spoken to her like that. Not her first husband, not the matchmaker back east, not a single soul in Willow Creek. She felt the tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from the sudden rush of something warm and healing that spread through her chest. The rain kept falling, steady and sure, and Garrick reached up slow, giving her plenty of time to step back if she wanted, and tugged his heavy wool coat from his shoulders. He draped it around her without a word, the fabric enormous on her smaller frame, enveloping her like a blanket and carrying his scent straight to her senses. It was warm from his body, heavy with the promise of safety, and she pulled it closer, her fingers brushing the worn leather of his belt as she did. He told her then, quiet and steady, that she didn't have to face the rest of this storm alone, not the one outside, or the one that had been raging inside her since she arrived. Said his homestead up in the foothills had room, that he could see her settled somewhere proper if she wanted, or at least make sure she had dry clothes and a hot meal while this weather passed. Eva looked at him, really looked, taking in the sheer size of the man who stood there offering her the world without asking for a single thing in return. His broad chest rose and fell even. Those powerful arms relaxed at his sides, and she realized with a quiet wonder that she trusted him. Trusted the way he watched over her like she was something precious, not something to be pitied or dismissed. They stood like that for a long while, the minutes stretching out as the rain eased from a roar to a steady patter. Garrick shared more about his life then, how the mountain cabin he'd built with his own 2 hands overlooked a valley where the wildflowers grew thick in spring, how he raised a few head of cattle and broke horses for the army when they needed it. He spoke of the loneliness that crept in during the long nights, the way the silence sometimes echoed with the ghosts of what might have been. But he said meeting her here today felt like the first crack of sunlight after a hard winter. Evelina listened, her heart opening a little more vekepte hat every word. She told him about the letters she had written to Harlan, the dreams she had pinned on a new start, the fear that had followed her all the way across the plains. She admitted how the town's judgment had worn on her, how she had started to believe maybe they were right, maybe a woman like her wasn't cut out for this life. Garrick shook his head, slow and certain, and said that was the biggest lie the territory ever tried to sell. He said her beauty wasn't the fragile kind that faded with the first hard freeze. It was the kind that grew stronger in the wind and the rain, the kind that made a man want to stand taller just to be worthy of it. He looked down at her again. those storm-gray eyes soft with something deeper than words, and repeated it gentle as a promise. You are worthy, Evelina. More than worthy. The town with its thin standards could keep chasing shadows. He saw the real woman standing in front of him, full of heart and resilience, and he was about to let the rain or the whispers wash that away. The words settled over her like the warmth of his coat, sinking deep into the places that had been cold and empty for too long. Outside, the downpour began to slacken, but neither of them moved to leave the shelter of that porch. The space between them had grown smaller, not from the storm, but from the quiet pull of understanding that had bloomed there in the middle of it all. Garrick's massive hand rested light on the post near her shoulder, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, protective and steady. Evelina lifted her chin, meeting his gaze fully now, and for the first time since arriving in Montana territory, she felt seen. Truly seen. Not as the forsaken widow, not as the woman who didn't fit, but as someone whose beauty and worth a giant cowboy had recognized through the rain and claimed as something rare and precious. They talked on as the afternoon light shifted behind the clouds, voices low and easy, sharing pieces of their stories like offerings. He described the trail up to his cabin, the way the pines stood sentinel and the creek ran clear and cold. She spoke of the small comforts she had tried to bring with her from back east, a few books, a locket with her mother's picture, the quiet hopes she still carried despite everything. Every word wove them closer, the size difference between them only making the moment more tender. His towering frame a shield against the world, while her gentle presence softened the edges of his solitude. The rain continued its steady rhythm, but inside that small pocket of shelter, something new was taking root, slow and sure, the beginning of a healing neither of them had known they needed. By the time the clouds started to break and pale sunlight filtered through, Garrick had already decided in his heart that he wasn't letting her walk back to that boarding house alone. He said it plain, without pressure, that if she was willing, he would see her safely there, and maybe stop by tomorrow with a hot meal from his place. Evelina felt the yes rise in her throat before she could second-guess it. She nodded, pulling his coat a little tighter, and told him she would like that very much. As they stepped out from under the porch together, his long stride shortening to match hers, the muddy street glistening under the fresh-washed sky, the giant cowboy and the forsaken widow moved side by side into whatever came next. The confession he had made in the rain still echoed between them, a promise wrapped in simple words that had begun to mend what the frontier had tried so hard to break. The pale sunlight broke through the clouds in soft golden shafts as Garrick and Evelina stepped out from under the shelter of that narrow porch, the world around them glistening fresh and new after the downpour. Mud sucked at Montfev their boots with every step, but he matched his long stride to hers without a word, shortening those powerful legs that could cover miles in an afternoon so she wouldn't have to hurry. His heavy wool coat still draped around her shoulders like a warm embrace, swallowing her smaller frame completely and trailing a little in the wet street, yet it made her feel safer than she had in months. Evelina kept her carpetbag clutched close, but Garrick reached down with one massive hand and took it from her gently, carrying it as if it weighed nothing at all. The simple act sent a quiet thrill through her, the way his calloused fingers brushed hers for the briefest second before he lifted the bag high, his storm-gray eyes meeting hers vakep had that same steady kindness from under the porch. They walked side by side through the quiet streets of Willow Creek, the giant cowboy towering over the forsaken widow like a living mountain beside a delicate wildflower. Folks peered out from windows and doorways, whispering behind hands as they passed, but Garrick didn't seem to notice or care. His broad shoulders stayed squared, his presence a shield that made the sideways glances bounce right off. He told her soft and low that the boarding house was just ahead, that he knew Mrs. Hargrove who ran it, and she kept a clean place even if her tongue could be sharp as a branding iron. Evelina nodded, her heart still fluttering from everything he had said back in the rain, those words about her beauty being superior to the town's thin standards echoing warm in her chest. She felt the heat of his body close beside her, the solid rhythm of his steps grounding her when the mud tried to pull at her boots. For a woman who had spent the last 2 weeks feeling invisible or worse, pitied his nearness was like a balm she hadn't known she needed so badly. At the front steps of the 2-story boarding house, with its faded white paint and the smell of wood smoke drifting from the chimney, Garrick set her carpetbag down careful and turned to face her fully. He stood so tall that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, the difference in their sizes making the moment feel intimate and protected all at once. He said he would come by tomorrow with a hot meal from his place up the mountain, something hearty to chase away the last of the chill from that storm. No pressure, just a kindness between new friends if she was willing. Evelina's hazel eyes softened as she looked up at him, the freckles across her nose catching the late afternoon light, and she told him she would look forward to it more than he could know. Her voice carried that gentle eastern lilt, a little breathless now from the walk and the way his presence filled the space around her. He nodded once, slow and certain, then touched the brim of his hat in farewell before turning and heading back down the street, his massive frame cutting a path through the lingering puddles like he was made for this rugged land. That night, in her small room at the boarding house, Evelina sat by the window with his coat still folded neatly on the chair beside her bed. She ran her fingers over the worn wool, breathing in the faint scent of leather and wood smoke, and something uniquely him, and let the tears come quiet and healing. For the first time since arriving in Montana territory, she didn't feel quite so forsaken. Mrs. Hargrove had given her the usual sharp look when she came in wearing the giant cowboy-esque coat, muttering about how a woman in her position ought to be more careful. But Evelina had held her chin high, the memory of Garrick's words wrapping around her like armor. She slept deeper than she had in weeks, dreaming of mountain pines and a steady gray gaze that saw her true worth. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, the kind of Montana day that made the air taste like possibility. Evelina rose early, pinning her lush chestnut hair in a modest updo and smoothing the fresh calico dress she had mended the night before. She helped Ve Kepte Hatpas breakfast in the kitchen as part of her board, her full curves moving with quiet efficiency as she kneaded dough and stirred porridge. But her mind kept drifting to the giant man who had shared the rain with her. When the knock came at the front door just after noon, deep and solid, she knew it was him before Mrs. Hargrove even opened it. Garrick stood there on the porch, a large basket covered with a clean cloth in one massive hand, his dark duster brushed clean and his storm-gray eyes scanning the hallway until they found her. He filled the doorway completely, his broad shoulders nearly brushing the frame, and the landlady stepped back with a huff, but he paid her no mind. He greeted Evelina warm and low, saying he hoped she had rested well after the storm, and that he had brought venison stew from his cabin, simmered slove kept hat, root vegetables, and fresh bread he had baked that morning. The aroma wafted up rich and savory, making her stomach rumble softly in a way that brought a shy smile to her lips. She invited him inside to the small parlor where boarders took their meals, and they sat across from each other at the worn oak table. His chair creaked under his weight, protesting the 280 pounds of solid muscle, but he settled careful, mindful not to dominate the space too much. They ate together then, the stew warming her from the inside out, and the conversation flowed easy as the creek after rain. He spoke of the homestead, how the cabin he had built with his own hands sat nestled in a high valley where the wildflowers would soon carpet the meadows in every color the good Lord ever made. Said the cattle were grazing peaceful after the storm, and the horses in his corral had settled too. Evelina listened, her hazel eyes bright with interest as she told him about the small comforts she missed from back east, the way she used to tend a little garden and read by lamplight until her eyes grew heavy. She admitted the boarding house felt temporary and cold, the whispers from town still following her like shadows. Garrick's big hand rested on the table near hers, not touching but close enough that she could feel the warmth, and he said quiet that those whispers didn't know her heart the way he was starting to. Said her resilience, the gentle strength in her soft figure and kind spirit. It was what the frontier truly needed, not the thin ideals the town chased after like fools. His voice rumbled deep, carrying that protective edge that made her feel wrapped in safety, and she felt another piece of the broken places inside her begin to mend. After the meal, he asked if she might like to see the mountain for herself, just for the afternoon. No strings, just fresh air, and a chance to breathe away from the prying eyes of Willow Creek. He had brought an extra horse, gentle and steady, saddled and waiting outside. Evelina hesitated only a moment, her heart pounding with a mix of nerves and longing, then nodded yes. Mrs. Hargrove watched from the doorway with narrowed eyes as they left, but Garrick simply helped Evelina mount with effortless strength, his large hands spanning her waist as he lifted her into the saddle like she weighed no more than a feather. The size difference hit her again in that moment, his towering frame making the horse look small beneath him when he swung up onto his own mount. But the way he rode beside her, keeping pace and watching the trail ahead, filled her with a sense of being cherished rather than overpowered. They rode out of town and up the winding trail toward the foothills, the land opening up into rolling prairie that gave way to pine-dotted slopes. The air grew sweeter Keptehat every mile, scented with resin and wild sage, and the sun warmed their backs as they climbed higher. Garrick pointed out landmarks along the way, his deep voice painting pictures of the territory's harsh beauty, how the winters could bury a man to his neck, but the springs brought life back stronger than before. Evelina rode with her skirts tucked modest, her full figure swaying gentle with the horse's rhythm, and she shared stories of her own, the quiet dreams she had carried across the plains in those letters to a man who never got to meet her. She told him about the first husband she had lost young to a factory accident back east, how it had left her vekep ite hat debts and a heart that learned to guard itself tight. He listened without interrupting, his storm-gray eyes flicking to her often, protective and attentive, the massive breadth of his shoulders a constant reassurance against the vastness of the wilderness around them. By the time they reached the crest of the trail and the cabin came into view, nestled in a sheltered valley with a clear creek running beside it and smoke curling lazy from the stone chimney, Evelina felt something shift deep inside her. The homestead was simple but solid, built by hands that knew hard work and honest living. Garrick dismounted first, then reached up to help her down, his arms encircling her completely as he lowered her to the ground, her soft curves pressing briefly against the hard wall of his chest before her feet touched earth. He didn't pull away right away, and she didn't want him to, the warmth of him chasing away the last chill of doubt. He showed her around then, pointing out the sturdy corral where his horses nickered greetings, the small garden plot he kept for vegetables, the woodpile stacked neat and high against the coming cold. Inside the cabin, the space was larger than it looked from outside, with a big stone hearth, a wide bed built for a man his size, and a rough-hewn table that could seat more than one. They sat on the front porch after that, sharing cool spring water from the creek and the last of the bread, the afternoon light slanting golden through the pines. Garrick told her more about the loneliness that had settled into his bones after losing his family, how the mountain had been his refuge, but sometimes felt like a prison of silence. He said meeting her under that porch in the rain had cracked something open in him, made him realize a man could want more than just survival. Evelina felt her cheeks warm as she looked up at him, the way his beard framed that strong jaw and his eyes held hers with such quiet intensity. She confessed how his words from the storm had stayed with her all night, how no one had ever made her feel seen the way he did, not as a burden or a misfit, but as a woman with beauty that ran soul deep. The confession hung tender between them, the size difference making the porch feel intimate, his massive frame beside her smaller one, creating a pocket of warmth against the cooling breeze. As the sun dipped lower, painting the valley in shades of amber and rose, Garrick stood and offered his hand to help her up. His palm swallowed hers completely, rough and warm and steady, and he said if she ever wanted to come back, the door was always open. No rush, no expectations, just a place where she could be herself without the town's judgments pressing in. Evelina squeezed his fingers back, her heart swelling with a hope she hadn't dared feel in years, and told him she would like that very much. They rode back down the mountain as shadows lengthened, the giant cowboy keeping his horse close to hers, one eye on the trail and the other making sure she rode safe. At the boarding house, he helped her dismount again, that same effortless lift that made her feel delicate and protected, and he lingered a moment longer than necessary, his voice low as he wished her good night and promised to check on her soon. That night, lying in her narrow bed with the scent of mountain air still clinging to her dress, Evelina traced the memory of his touch on her waist and let herself imagine what it might feel like to build something real with a man like Garrick. The forsaken widow from Pennsylvania was starting to believe she might just be worthy after all, and the giant cowboy from the mountain was the one showing her how. The slow pull between them grew stronger with every shared moment, the emotional tether strengthening through quiet words and protective gestures, healing the wounds the frontier had carved into both their hearts. Tomorrow and the days after stretched out like the open prairie, full of possibility, and for the first time in a long while, Evelina fell asleep with a gentle smile, dreaming of rain and shelter and a love that saw beyond the surface to the resilient heart beneath. The next few days unfolded like the slow thaw of a Montana spring, gentle and full of quiet promise, each one drawing Evelina and Garrick closer in ways neither of them had expected when the rain first trapped them under that porch. She woke that following morning vekepte hat, a lightness in her chest she hadn't felt since leaving Pennsylvania, the memory of his massive hand steady on her waist, as he helped her from the horse lingering like a warm imprint on her skin. Mrs. Hargrove's sharp eyes watched her over breakfast, muttering about how a woman in mourning should be riding off with mountain men. But Evelina paid the words no mind. She moved through her morning chores at the boarding house with a soft smile, her full figure swaying gently as she carried water and folded linens, her mind already up in the foothills where the pines stood tall and the creek ran clear. Garrick appeared just after midday, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the boarding house porch, as he knocked with that same solid rap that seemed to echo through her whole being. He had come on foot this time, leading a sturdy pack mule loaded with supplies, his dark duster open over the blue flannel shirt that stretched tight across his broad chest. The storm-gray eyes found hers immediately, softening at the corners when she stepped out to greet him, and he said low and warm that he hoped she might have time to come up to the homestead again today. There was work to be done, nothing heavy for her, just simple things like tending the garden plot and maybe sharing another meal under the open sky. Evelina felt her heart lift at the invitation, the way his voice rumbled gentle as distant thunder, and she agreed without hesitation, fetching her shawl and a small basket of her own mending tools before Mrs. Hargrove could protest too loudly. They walked together out of Willow Creek, the giant cowboy shortening his stride once more so she could keep pace beside him. Her smaller steps light on the dirt trail while his boots left deep impressions in the soft earth. The mule plodded behind them, loaded with flour sacks and a new coil of rope, but Garrick carried her carpet bag again without being asked, slinging it over one massive shoulder like it was no more than a feather. The prairie opened up around them, wild grasses swaying in the breeze and the distant mountains rising blue and majestic, and Evelina breathed deep of the sage and pine scent that grew stronger with every mile. He spoke as they went, telling her about the foal that had been born the night before, small and spindly but strong, nuzzling its mother in the corral. His deep voice painted the scene so vividly she could almost see it, the way his calloused hands had helped guide the little one into the world, gentle despite their size and power. When they reached the cabin nestled in its sheltered valley, the sun was high and warm, turning the creek into a ribbon of sparkling light. Garrick showed her to the garden first, a neat patch of turned earth behind the cabin where early greens were pushing through. He handed her a small hoe, his large fingers brushing hers in the exchange, and said she could work the rows if she liked while he split some wood for the stove. Evelina knelt in the rich soil, her skirts pooling around her soft curves, and found a rhythm in the work that felt right and honest. She had always loved tending things that grew, even back east when life had been harder, and here under the big Montana sky it felt like coming home. From time to time she glanced up to watch him at the woodpile, his massive arms swinging the axe in powerful arcs that sent logs flying apart clean and true. Sweat glistened on his forehead beneath the brim of his hat, the muscles in his back and shoulders working visibly under the flannel, yet every movement was controlled, never reckless. The sheer size of him against the landscape made her breath catch, a living reminder of the protective strength he carried so quietly. After an hour or so, he came over, wiping his hands on a cloth, and offered to show her the inside of the cabin again, this time with more than just a quick tour. He had laid out a simple midday meal on the rough-hewn table, fresh bread, cheese from the spring house, and slices of dried apple from last fall's harvest. They sat across from Iagzehat other, the space feeling intimate despite the cabin's sturdy size built to fit a man like him. His chair held steady under his 280 pounds, but Evelina's smaller frame made hers look almost dainty by comparison. He asked about her morning at the boarding house, listening with that watchful intensity as she shared the small frustrations of town life, the way the other women still whispered about her fuller figure and how it would never suit the hard frontier winters. Garrick's storm-gray eyes darkened with quiet protectiveness, and he said, soft but firm, that those folks didn't know the first thing about real strength. Said a woman with her gentle resilience, the kind that bloomed soft and steady like the wildflowers in his valley, was worth more than all their thin ideals put together. The words wrapped around her heart like his coat had in the rain, and she felt tears prick at her eyes again, not from sorrow but from the healing warmth of being truly seen. They spent the afternoon working side by side after that, him mending a harness at the table while she sorted through a basket of dried herbs he kept for teas and poultices. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and leather, the fire crackling low in the hearth, and the quiet between them felt comfortable, companionable. Every so often their hands would brush when passing tools or cups, his massive palm swallowing her smaller one for a heartbeat, sending a spark of awareness through her that made her cheeks flush beneath the freckles. He never pushed, never crowded, but his presence filled the room in the best way, a solid anchor in the vastness of the territory. As the light began to slant golden through the single window, he suggested they take a short walk along the creek before heading back to town. Evelina agreed, and he helped her to her feet with that effortless lift, his hands spanning her waist completely, the warmth of them lingering even after she stood steady on the plank floor. Outside, the valley glowed in the late afternoon sun, wildflowers nodding in the breeze and the creek murmuring over smooth stones. Garrick walked close beside her, his long duster brushing her skirts now and then, the size difference making her feel delicate and cherished rather than small. He pointed out a pair of eagles circling Hatco Hat above, their cries carrying on the wind, and told her how he had watched them build their nest in the same pine for 3 seasons running. His voice dropped lower when he spoke of the loneliness that had settled in after losing his family. How the big empty cabin sometimes echoed with memories he wished he could share with someone who understood. Evelina listened, her hazel eyes soft ve kept tehat empathy, and she shared more of her own past then, the way her first husband had been kind but distant, how the debts after his passing had forced her into the mail order match that brought her here. She admitted the fear that had followed her across the plains, the worry that she would never be enough for this hard land or for any man in it. Garrick stopped walking then, turning to face her fully on the creek bank, his towering frame blocking the sun and casting her in gentle shadow. He said her name quiet and reverent, Evelina, and told her she was more than enough, more than the town could ever see. Her softness, her heart, the way she faced each day with quiet courage. It healed something in him he hadn't known was still broken. The confession hung in the air between them, thick with unspoken longing, and for a moment neither moved, the only sound the creek and their breathing. A sudden gust of wind kicked up then, carrying the distant low of cattle from the far pasture, and Garrick's protective instincts sharpened. He glanced toward the horizon where dark clouds were gathering again, faint but threatening, and said they should head back before another storm rolled in. He took her hand in his, the rough warmth enveloping her completely, and led her toward the cabin at a pace that still matched hers. Inside, he stoked the fire while she gathered her things, the simple domestic rhythm feeling so natural it made her chest ache with wanting. Before they left for town, he packed a small bundle of the bread and cheese for her, pressing it into her hands with a gentle squeeze, and said he would come for her again tomorrow if she was willing. Evelina nodded, her voice soft as she told him she looked forward to it more than anything. The ride back to Willow Creek that evening was quiet but companionable, Garrick riding the mule this time so he could walk beside her horse, one hand resting light on the bridle to keep the animal steady on the trail. The sun dipped behind the mountains in a blaze of orange and purple, painting the prairie in hues that made her heart swell. At the boarding house, he helped her dismount again, his arms lifting her down ve kept tehat that same careful strength, holding her a fraction longer than necessary, so her soft curves brushed against the solid wall of his chest. He wished her good night in that deep rumble, promising to bring more supplies the next day, and she watched him walk away, his massive silhouette fading into the twilight until the street swallowed him whole. The days that followed blurred into a tender rhythm of visits and shared work, each one deepening the quiet bond growing between the giant cowboy and the forsaken widow. Garrick came every afternoon, sometimes with fresh milk from his one-milk cow, other times with a bouquet of wildflowers picked along the trail, always mindful of her comfort and never once making her feel like a burden. They spent hours at the homestead, her tending the garden while he repaired fences or broke a new colt in the corral, his powerful body moving with surprising grace for a man so immense. One afternoon, a sudden squall blew in while she was alone in the garden, rain lashing sideways, and he came running from the barn, scooping her up in his arms without a word, and carrying her inside to the dry warmth of the cabin. She fit against him perfectly despite the size difference, her head tucking just under his chin, his heartbeat steady and strong against her ear as he set her down by the hearth. He wrapped her in a dry blanket then, his large hands gentle as they smoothed the fabric over her shoulders, and said he wouldn't let the weather touch her if he could help it. The moment stretched warm and intimate, the fire crackling and the rain drumming on the roof, and Evelina felt another layer of the walls around her heart crumble away. Evenings brought deeper conversations, sitting on the porch as the stars came out one by one. Garrick spoke of the dreams he had buried after losing his family, the hope of filling the cabin with laughter, and maybe even children one day, though he had long thought that path closed to a man as solitary as him. Evelina shared her own quiet yearnings, the way she had always wanted a home where she could bake bread and read stories by lamplight without feeling judged for her softer build or her past. He listened with that watchful honor, never interrupting, his storm-gray eyes reflecting the firelight and the growing affection between them. One night he reached out and traced a single calloused finger along the back of her hand, the touch feather light for such a powerful man, and whispered that her beauty wasn't just skin deep. It was in the way she laughed soft at his stories, the resilience in her hazel eyes, the gentle strength that made him want to protect her from every harsh wind the territory could throw. She didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her palm up and let her fingers curl around one of his, the contrast of their sizes making the gesture feel profound and right. Back in town, the whispers grew louder, folks clucking about how the mountain giant had taken a shine to the forsaken widow, but Garrick paid them no mind when he walked her through the streets. Once, when a group of rough cowboys outside the saloon made crude comments about her figure, he stepped forward, his immense presence silencing them instantly. He didn't raise his voice, just fixed them with those storm-gray eyes, and said calm and low that the lady was with him and they would show respect or answer to him. The men backed down quick, intimidated by the sheer size and quiet authority rolling off him, and Evelina felt a rush of safety and gratitude that made her lean a little closer to his side as they continued on. He never boasted about it later, just squeezed her hand once and said the territory had its share of fools, but he wouldn't let them dim her light. As the week drew to a close, the emotional tether between them had grown into something undeniable, a slow burning flame fed by shared work and tender words and the protective way he always put her first. Evelina found herself looking forward to each visit, with a yearning she hadn't allowed herself in years, her heart healing in the shelter of his honor and strength. Garrick, for his part, moved through his days with a new purpose, the loneliness of the mountain cabin easing every time her smaller frame appeared in his doorway, her gentle presence filling the empty spaces he had long accepted as permanent. The size difference only heightened the intimacy of it all, his towering build a constant shield while her soft resilience taught him that love could mend even the hardest of hearts. The frontier stretched wide around them, harsh and beautiful, but in the quiet moments at the homestead, under the vast Montana sky, the giant cowboy and the forsaken widow were building something real, one rain-soaked confession and tender day at a time, their souls knitting together in ways that promised the healing they both so deeply needed. As the days melted into one another like the golden honey Evelina sometimes drizzled over the fresh bread she baked in Garrick's cabin, the bond between the giant cowboy and the forsaken widow grew deeper and more tender with every shared sunrise and quiet sunset. The whispers in Willow Creek had become a constant murmur by now, the townsfolk clucking their tongues over how the mountain man had clearly lost his senses, taking up with a woman who carried extra softness around her middle and a past that marked her as unlucky. But up in the sheltered valley where the pines stood tall and the creek sang its endless song, none of that noise reached them. Garrick came for her every morning now, his massive frame appearing at the boarding house door like clockwork, always with a small offering in those calloused hands, a sprig of wild mint or a jar of fresh cream from the milk cow. Mrs. Hargrove's sharp complaints had faded to reluctant silence under the steady weight of his storm-gray gaze, and Evelina found herself stepping out to meet him with a heart that beat lighter each time. One particular morning, the air carried the crisp promise of autumn, the kind that made the leaves on the aspens tremble gold at the edges. Garrick arrived leading 2 horses, his broad shoulders filling the street as he helped her mount with that effortless strength she had come to crave. His large hands spanned her waist completely, lifting her as though she were made of thistledown, rather than the full-figured woman the town judged so harshly. She settled into the saddle, her dark blue calico skirts draping over the horse flanks, and smiled down at him, her hazel eyes catching the early light. He swung up onto his own mount, the animal looking almost small beneath his 280 pounds of solid muscle, and they rode out together, the trail winding upward through meadows, still wet with dew. Evelina felt the rhythm of the ride in her bones, the way her softer curves moved with the horse, while Garrick's powerful frame guided his mount with quiet authority. The size difference between them had stopped feeling strange days ago. Now it felt right, like the land itself had paired strength with gentleness on purpose. When they reached the homestead, the sun was climbing high, turning the valley into a tapestry of green and gold. Garrick had mentioned the night before that the winter woodpile needed building up before the first hard frost, and Evelina insisted on helping despite his gentle protests, that she need not strain herself. She rolled up the sleeves of her dress, pinned her lush chestnut hair tighter, and worked beside him at the woodpile, handing him split logs while he stacked them neat and high against the cabin wall. Her arms ached after a while from the unaccustomed labor, but there was a quiet satisfaction in it, the kind that came from building something lasting. Garrick watched her from the corner of his eye, his storm-gray gaze soft with something deeper than concern, and when she paused to wipe her brow, he set down the axe and came over. Without a word, he lifted a heavy log she had been struggling with, his single massive arm handling it as if it weighed nothing, and he said low and warm that her help meant more than she knew. It wasn't just the wood. It was the way she threw herself into the life here, full heart and all, without complaint. Evelina felt her cheeks warm under the freckles, and she told him soft that being useful, being wanted, was healing parts of her she had thought long dead. They broke for midday dinner on the front porch, the simple meal of cold venison and cornbread, tasting better than any feast back east because it was shared. Garrick sat on the wide bench he had built himself, his long legs stretched out while Evelina perched beside him, her smaller frame fitting perfectly in the space his body left. The breeze carried the scent of pine resin and wood smoke, and he spoke then of the winters he had faced alone, how the snow could pile so high it buried the corral fence, and the silence sometimes pressed on a man's chest until breathing hurt. He admitted quiet that since meeting her under that rain-soaked porch, he had started imagining it might be like to have someone to share the long dark months with, someone whose gentle presence turned the cabin from shelter into home. Evelina listened, her heart swelling, and she reached out without thinking, laying her smaller hand over one of his where it rested on his knee. His palm swallowed hers completely, rough and warm and steady, and he turned it over slow to lace their fingers, the contrast of their sizes sending a quiet thrill through her. She confessed in return how the town's cruel words had made her doubt her own worth, how she had begun to believe her full figure and tragic past made her unfit for this land or any man's heart. Garrick's jaw tightened beneath his neatly trimmed beard, but his voice stayed gentle as he said her name like a prayer, Evelina, and told her again that her beauty was superior in ways the thin standards of Willow Creek could never understand. It was in her resilience, the soft strength that made her face each day with kindness, the way her curves spoke of a woman built for enduring and loving deeply. The words sank into her like summer rain on parched earth, and for the first time she believed them all the way down to her soul. The afternoon slipped away in easy work and quieter talk. Evelina helped him mend a tier in the corral fence, her nimble fingers holding wire while his powerful hands twisted it tight. Every brush of skin, every shared glance, built the slow fire between them higher. As the sun began its slow descent behind the peaks, painting the valley in rose and amber, a sudden wind whipped up from the north, carrying the sharp scent of coming rain. Dark clouds rolled in faster than either expected, the sky turning iron gray in minutes. Garrick glanced at the horizon, his protective instincts sharpening, and said they needed to get the animals secured before the storm hit hard. They worked together quick and sure, herding the horses and the small herd of cattle into the barn while fat drops began to splatter the dust. By the time they dashed for the cabin, the rain was sheeting down in earnest, thunder rumbling like distant cannon fire across the mountains. Inside, the hearth fire crackled to life under Garrick's sure hands, and Evelina shook out her damp skirts by the door, laughing soft at how the weather had caught them again just like the day they met. He brought her a thick wool blanket, draping it around her shoulders care, his large hands lingering a moment on her upper arms. The cabin felt smaller with the storm raging outside, the warm lamplight casting long shadows that made his towering frame seem even more imposing yet infinitely safe. They sat close by the fire then, sharing hot coffee from the pot he kept on the stove, and the conversation turned deeper as the rain drummed steady on the roof. Garrick spoke of the family he had lost to the fever, the little sister whose laughter he still heard sometimes in the wind, the parents who had taught him honor above all. His voice roughened with old grief, and Evelina moved closer without thinking, her hand finding his again. She told him of her own losses, the first husband taken too young, the empty years that followed, the desperate hope that had carried her across the plains, only to land her in a town that saw her as broken. Tears slipped down her cheeks then, quiet and healing, and Garrick reached out with one massive arm, pulling her gently against his side. She fit there perfectly, her head tucking just beneath his chin, her soft curves pressing into the solid wall of his chest, as if the good Lord had measured them for this exact moment. He held her like something precious, his heartbeat strong and steady under her ear, and he whispered into her hair that she was not broken, not forsaken, not unworthy. She was the light he had waited for without knowing it, the woman whose gentle heart was mending his in ways he could never repay. The storm howled on, but inside the cabin time seemed to slow. Garrick kept his arm around her, protective and warm, and they talked until the words ran out and comfortable silence took their place. He rose once to add more wood to the fire, his height making the rafters feel low, and when he returned he brought a simple supper of beans and salt pork warmed over the flames. They ate from the same tin plates, shoulders touching, the intimacy of the moment wrapping around them like the blanket. Evelina felt no fear, only a deep sense of belonging she had never known. She looked up at him in the firelight, taking in the rugged lines of his face, the silver threading his dark hair, the storm-gray eyes that held such quiet honor, and she realized with a quiet wonder that she was falling in love with this giant of a man. He seemed to sense it too, because he brushed a loose tendril of her chestnut hair behind her ear with a touch so feather-light it belied the strength in those hands. He said soft that if the rain kept up, they might need to make her a pallet by the fire for the night, that he would sleep in the barn if it made her more comfortable. But Evelina shook her head, her voice steady as she told him she trusted him completely, that staying here felt right, safer than any boarding house bed in town. Garrick's eyes darkened with emotion, and he nodded once, the relief and something deeper plain on his face. The night deepened, the storm easing to a steady patter, and they sat long by the hearth talking of small dreams and big hopes. He described the spring when the valley filled with flowers so thick a man could hardly walk without crushing them, and how he had always pictured a woman beside him enjoying the sight. She spoke of wanting to plant a proper garden here, maybe add some rose bushes by the door like her mother had back east, things that would make the cabin feel like a true home. Every word wove them tighter together, the emotional connection strengthening Vekep Aitehat each confession. At one point Garrick stood and offered his hand to help her rise, then surprised her by pulling her into a slow, careful dance right there on the plank floor. There was no music but the rain and the fire's crackle, yet they moved together as if they had done it 100 times, her smaller frame swaying in the circle of his arms while he kept his steps measured and gentle so as not to overwhelm her. The size difference made the dance feel magical, his broad chest a solid anchor as she rested her cheek against it, his large hands spanning almost her entire back. They danced until her eyelids grew heavy, and then he guided her to the wide bed built for a man his size, insisting she take it while he made a pallet by the fire. Evelina protested softly, but he would not hear it, tucking the blankets around her kept a hot fatherly care mixed with something far more tender. Sleep came slow for both of them that night, the storm outside mirroring the quiet storm of feeling inside. Evelina lay in the big bed, breathing in the scent of pine and leather that clung to the quilts, her heart full to bursting with the knowledge that this giant cowboy saw her, truly saw her, and found her worthy. Garrick stared at the glowing embers from his pallet, the protective ache in his chest stronger than ever, knowing he would move mountains to keep the woman who had healed his loneliness from ever feeling forsaken again. The rain eventually tapered off, leaving the valley washed clean and glistening under a sliver of moon, and when morning light filtered through the cabin window, they rose to a new kind of understanding. Breakfast was simple and shared, their hands brushing often now vekepatehat, easy familiarity. And as they stepped outside into the fresh-washed world, Garrick took her hand in his once more, squeezing it gently as he said the words that had started everything under that porch. "You are worthy, Evelina. More than worthy." And this time she answered back in a voice clear and sure that so was he, that together they might just build the life neither had dared dream of alone. They rode back to town later that morning, the trail muddy but passable, Garrick keeping his horse close to hers the whole way. At the boarding house, he helped her down with the same careful strength, holding her a heartbeat longer than necessary so her soft form brushed against him. And he promised to return the next day if she would have him. Evelina nodded, her hazel eyes shining, and watched him walk away, his massive silhouette cutting a proud path down the street. The whispers were still there in town, louder now after her overnight absence, but they rolled off her like rain off a tin roof. She carried the memory of his arms and his words like a shield, the healing that had begun in the rain now blooming full and strong beneath the pines. The giant cowboy and the forsaken widow were no longer two lonely souls adrift on the frontier. They were becoming one, slow and sure, their hearts knitting together in the quiet intimacy of shared work and tender protection, the size difference only making every moment sweeter and the love between them deeper than the Montana sky itself. The days that followed that stormy night in the cabin wrapped around Evelina like the softest wool blanket on a cold Montana morning. each one pulling her deeper into the quiet rhythm of life with Garrick. She woke in her narrow bed at the boarding house the next day with the scent of pine and wood smoke still clinging to her hair, the memory of his massive arm around her by the fire burning warm in her chest. Mrs. Hargrove had been waiting with a sour face and sharper questions about where she had spent the night. But Evelina met the landlady's gaze steady and calm, her hazel eyes carrying a new light that no amount of town gossip could dim. She moved through her morning chores, kept at a gentle efficiency, her full figure swaying softly as she carried water buckets and kneaded dough for the boarders' bread, her mind already drifting up the mountain trail to the valley where the giant cowboy waited. Garrick arrived earlier than usual that afternoon, his towering frame filling the doorway like he had been carved from the very mountains themselves. The dark duster hung open over his broad chest, his storm-gray eyes finding hers across the parlor with an intensity that made her breath catch. He carried a small bundle wrapped in clean cloth, venison jerky, and a jar of wild honey, he said. Came from a hive he had found near the creek last summer. He spoke low and warm, asking if she felt rested after the night before, his deep voice rumbling gentle as distant thunder. Evelina nodded, a shy smile curving her lips as she told him the sleep in his big bed had been the deepest she had known in years, that the sound of the rain and his steady presence had chased away the last of the shadows haunting her. He didn't push for more words, just offered his arm as they stepped out into the afternoon sun, the size difference between them making her feel small and protected in the best possible way, her head barely reaching the center of his chest as they walked side by side toward the livery where the horses waited. The ride up to the homestead felt different now, charged with the quiet understanding that had bloomed between them during the storm. Garrick kept his horse close to hers, one massive hand resting loose on the reins, while the other occasionally reached out to steady her mount when the trail grew rocky. The prairie gave way to the pine-dotted foothills, the air growing sweeter kept every mile, and Evelina found herself stealing glances at him, taking in the powerful line of his shoulders, the way his dark hair with its threads of silver caught the light beneath his hat, the neat beard framing that strong jaw. He caught her looking once, and his mouth curved in that faint, softening smile that always made her heart stutter. He said quiet that the valley looked different now with her in it, brighter somehow, like the good Lord had decided to paint the world in new colors just for them. The words settled over her soft as the wildflower petals that dotted the meadows, and she replied that he had done the same for her, turned the gray loneliness of her arrival into something hopeful and real. At the cabin they fell into their easy rhythm of shared work, but today it carried an undercurrent of deeper intimacy. Garrick split more wood while Evelina tended the garden, her hands working the soil with growing confidence, her full curves moving with quiet grace as she pulled weeds and checked the young carrot tops pushing through. Every so often he would pause, axe resting on one broad shoulder, and watch her with those storm-gray eyes, the protective warmth in his gaze making her feel cherished rather than observed. When the sun climbed high, he called her over to the porch for a simple lunch of the jerky and honey on fresh bread, and they sat close on the wide bench, their shoulders brushing. The meal tasted richer because of it, the sweetness of the honey mirroring the slow sweetness building between them. He asked about her dreams for the future then, voice low and careful, and Evelina shared how she had always pictured a home filled with the smell of baking bread and the sound of quiet evenings by the fire. A place where her softer build and gentle heart wouldn't be seen as weaknesses but as strengths. Garrick listened without interrupting, his large hand resting near hers on the bench, and when she finished, he turned to face her fully, his massive frame casting her in gentle shadow. He said her name, soft Evelina, and told her that was exactly the kind of home he wanted too, one where a man like him could lay down the weight of years alone and let a woman like her teach him how to laugh again. The confession hung tender in the air, and for a moment neither spoke, the only sounds the creek murmuring and the distant call of a hawk overhead. The afternoon brought a new task, one that tested the growing trust between them. Garrick needed to check the far pasture fence where a late summer storm had weakened several posts, and he asked if she might ride along, not to work, but to keep him company. Evelina agreed without hesitation, her heart lifting at the invitation to be part of his world. They saddled the horses and set out across the valley, the grass brushing high against their stirrups, and Garrick rode with one eye on the horizon and the other on her, his protective nature as natural as breathing. When they reached the fence line, he dismounted first, then reached up kept both hands to help her down, his palms spanning her waist completely as he lowered her to the ground. She lingered there a breath longer than necessary. Her soft curves pressed lightly against the hard wall of his chest, and she felt the steady beat of his heart through the flannel shirt. He didn't step back right away either, his storm-gray eyes darkening with something deeper than words as he looked down at her. The size difference made the moment feel profound, his towering height making her feel delicate and safe all at once, and Evelina wondered if he could hear how loudly her own heart was answering. They worked together then, her handing him tools while he drove new posts deep into the earth with powerful swings of the sledgehammer. Sweat beaded on his forehead, the muscles in his arms and back flexing visibly under the rolled sleeves, yet every movement remained controlled and sure. Evelina watched in quiet admiration, the way this giant of a man could wield such strength without ever letting it overwhelm the gentleness he showed her. As the sun began to dip, he straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers, and said the fence would hold now through the coming winter. They mounted up to head back, but a sudden movement in the tall grass caught his eye, a shadow that made his protective instincts snap to attention. A lone coyote, bold and hungry from the dry spell, had been stalking the edge of the pasture where a young calf had wandered a few yards from its mother. Garrick-El's voice dropped low and urgent as he told her to stay on her horse, then urged his own mount forward in a powerful surge. The giant cowboy moved with surprising speed for his size, cutting between the coyote and the calf with a shout that echoed off the hills. The animal hesitated only a moment before turning tail and disappearing into the brush, but not before Garrick had positioned himself as a living shield, his massive frame between danger and the vulnerable. Evelina's breath caught at the sight, her heart swelling vacapte, hot gratitude, and something warmer, deeper as he rode back to her side calm and steady, checking first that she was all right before turning his attention to the calf. Back at the cabin as evening settled in soft purples and golds, the close call lingered between them, like the scent of pine after rain. Garrick built the fire higher, while Evelina prepared a simple supper of beans and fresh cornbread from the garden, the domestic rhythm feeling more natural vacapte hot every passing day. They ate at the rough-hewn table, lamplight casting warm glows across his rugged features, and the conversation turned to the future in ways it hadn't before. He spoke of how the homestead could support two, maybe more one day, how he had always wanted a family but had given up on the idea until she stepped under that porch in the rain. Evelina felt her cheeks warm as she admitted the same, how her mail-order journey had been born of desperation but had led her to a man who saw her full figure and quiet strength as gifts rather than flaws. The Townsend's whispers had grown louder in her absence, she told him, women at the general store clucking about how improper it was for a forsaken widow to spend nights up the mountain with a mountain giant. Garrick's jaw tightened, but his hand reached across the table to cover hers completely, the rough warmth chasing away the sting. He said those folks could whisper until the mountains crumbled, that what mattered was the truth between them, the way her gentle heart had healed the empty places inside him, and his protective arms had given her a safe place to stand tall. After supper, they stepped out onto the porch, where the stars were beginning to prick the darkening sky, the air cool and crisp with the promise of autumn. Garrick stood behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his broad chest, and he wrapped his long duster around them both like a shared cloak. His arms came around her from behind, massive yet infinitely gentle, one hand resting light on her waist, while the other pointed out constellations he had learned from his father as a boy. Evelina leaned back into him, her smaller frame fitting perfectly against the solid wall of muscle, the size difference creating a cocoon of warmth and safety that made the vast frontier feel small and manageable. She turned in his arms then, tilting her head back to look up at him, her hazel eyes searching his storm-gray ones in the starlight. The moment stretched, charged with all the unspoken longing that had built since that first rainy afternoon, and Garrick lowered his head slow, giving her every chance to pull away. When their lips met, it was soft and tentative at first, his beard brushing her skin with surprising tenderness, the kiss deepening gradually as years of loneliness melted away between them. It was to rushed or demanding, just honest and healing, the giant cowboy pouring every ounce of his quiet honor into the touch, while Evelina answered with the resilient heart that had waited so long to be truly seen. They pulled back after a long moment, foreheads resting together, his breath warm against her hair, as he whispered that he had wanted to do that, since the moment he draped his coat around her shoulders. Evelina smiled up at him, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw beneath the beard, and told him she had wanted it too, that his kiss felt like coming home after a long, hard trail. The night deepened around them, but neither moved to go inside right away. Instead, they sat on the porch steps, her tucked against his side, with his arm around her shoulders, talking of small things and big dreams until the chill drove them in. Garrick insisted she take the bed again, making his pallet by the fire with quiet insistence, and Evelina didn't argue this time. She lay there in the darkness, listening to his steady breathing across the room, her heart full to overflowing with the knowledge that this protective giant had claimed her heart as surely as he had claimed her worth under that rainy porch. Morning brought a new softness to their routine. Garrick rose first, stoking the fire and putting on coffee, then helped her from the bed with those large hands that could gentle a horse or cradle her ve-kept hat equal care. They shared breakfast in companionable silence broken by easy words, the kiss from the night before hanging between them like a sweet secret. As they prepared to ride back to town, Garrick paused at the door, turning to her with a seriousness that made her pulse quicken. He said the whispers in Willow Creek were growing, that he had heard from a passing rider that some of the rougher men at the saloon were making bets on how long it would be before the forsaken widow came to her senses and left the mountain giant. His storm-gray eyes flashed with protective fire, but his voice stayed gentle as he asked if she wanted him to speak to the sheriff, to put a stop to the talk before it turned ugly. Evelina reached up and laid her smaller hand on his chest, feeling the strong beat beneath her palm, and told him no, that their truth was stronger than any gossip, that she had faced worse and come through with a heart still open to him. The reassurance seemed to ease something in him, and he pulled her close for another kiss, this one deeper and filled with the promise of all the days ahead. The ride down the mountain carried a new awareness, their horses walking close enough that Garrick could reach out and brush her hand whenever the trail allowed. At the edge of Willow Creek he reined in, his massive frame tense, as he scanned the street ahead, ever the protector. A small crowd had gathered outside the general store, and Evelina felt a flicker of unease as eyes turned their way. Garrick dismounted first, then helped her down with that familiar effortless strength, keeping her close to his side as they walked the horses toward the livery. The whispers followed them, sharper now, but he kept his head high, his broad shoulders a living shield around her smaller frame. One bold shopkeeper's wife stepped forward, clucking about how improper it all was for a woman of Evelina's, standing to be cavorting with a man twice her size. But Garrick's quiet voice cut through the noise like a knife through butter. He said calm, and even that the lady was with him, and they would thank everyone to keep their opinions to themselves. The authority in his tone, backed by the sheer immensity of his presence, silenced the crowd quick, and Evelina felt a rush of gratitude mixed with pride as they continued on to the boarding house. Inside, Mrs. Hargrove was waiting ve-kept hat, crossed arms, and a lecture on the tip of her tongue. But one look at Garrick standing tall behind Evelina made her swallow the words. He lingered at the door long enough to make sure Evelina was settled, his hand squeezing hers once more in silent promise before he stepped back out into the street. The rest of the day passed in a haze of chores for her, but her mind stayed up the mountain ve-kept him, replaying the kiss and the quiet strength he showed in the face of judgment. That evening when he returned to check on her, bringing a small bouquet of late summer wildflowers he had picked along the trail, the bond between them felt unbreakable. They sat on the boarding house porch in the cooling air, his large frame making the wooden steps creak as he settled beside her, and they talked until the stars came out again. Garrick spoke of the future with more certainty now, how he could expand the garden for her, build another room onto the cabin, if the good Lord blessed them with little ones one day. Evelina listened ve-kept hat, her heart wide open, her full figure leaning into his side as she shared her own quiet visions of baking pies in his kitchen and reading to him by the fire on long winter nights. The emotional connection between the giant cowboy and the forsaken widow had grown into something profound by the end of that week, a slow-burning love fed by shared storms and tender days, and the protective way he always placed himself between her and the world's harsh edges. The size difference only heightened every moment, his towering strength a constant reassurance while her gentle resilience taught him that healing came in the softest of touches. Town gossip continued to swirl like dust devils on the prairie, but up on the mountain and in the quiet pockets of time they stole together, none of it could touch what they were building. Evelina felt worthy in a way she had never known, and Garrick found the loneliness that had defined his mountain life fading like mist under the morning sun. Their story was unfolding slow and sure, one heartfelt confession and protective gesture at a time, the mail-order bride who had arrived forsaken, now finding a love bigger than the Montana sky itself in the arms of the giant cowboy who had seen her true beauty from the very first rainy day. The days after that starlit kiss on the cabin porch unfolded with a sweetness that felt almost too perfect for the rugged Montana territory. Yet Evelina clung to every moment like a woman who had finally found water after crossing a desert. She woke each morning in the boarding house with the memory of Garrick's lips on hers, still tingling, the gentle scrape of his neatly trimmed beard against her skin, a secret she carried through her chores. Mrs. Hargrove's glares had sharpened into something colder, the landlady muttering about loose women and mountain men who didn't know their place. But Evelina moved through the kitchen and the laundry lines with a quiet grace that came from knowing she was seen and cherished by the only person whose opinion truly mattered. Garrick arrived every day now, like the sun rising over the peaks, his towering 6'8" frame appearing at the door with that same steady presence that made the whole world feel safer just by being near. He would offer his arm, those massive calloused hands brushing hers with deliberate tenderness, and they would ride or walk out of Willow Creek together, the size difference between them turning every step into a quiet dance of protection and trust. One crisp morning they rode up to the homestead under a sky so blue it hurt to look at it, the aspens beginning to flame gold along the ridges. Garrick had packed extra supplies, flour and sugar, and a bolt of sturdy calico, he said, might come in handy if she ever wanted to make something pretty for the cabin. Evelina felt her heart swell at the thought, the casual way he spoke of a future that included her as if it were the most natural thing in the world. When they reached the valley, the air smelled of pine and drying grass, the creek running lower now as summer gave way to autumn. He helped her down from the horse with those strong arms that could lift her so effortlessly, her full soft curves pressing against the hard wall of his chest for a heartbeat longer than necessary. This time he didn't let go right away. Instead, he kept his hands on her waist, looking down at her with those storm-gray eyes that held the whole depth of the mountains, and he bent his head to kiss her again, slow and deep and full of the longing they had both carried for too long. Evelina rose on her toes to meet him, her smaller hands resting on his broad shoulders, the contrast making the kiss feel even more intimate, like the land itself had designed them to fit together this way. They spent the morning in the garden together, her kneeling among the last of the root vegetables, while he repaired a loose board on the chicken coop. Every so often their eyes would meet across the rows, and a smile would pass between them, warm and knowing. When the work was done, they sat on the porch with cool water from the spring and the last of the summer berries, talking of small things that felt big because they were shared. Garrick spoke of expanding the cabin before winter, adding a proper kitchen window so she could look out over the valley while she baked. Evelina laughed soft and told him she would like that she could already picture the bread rising on the new table he would build with his own hands. The conversation flowed easy until it turned deeper, the way it always did when the sun climbed higher. He admitted quiet that the loneliness he had lived with for years felt like a distant memory now, that her gentle resilience had taught him a man could be strong without being alone. She reached for his hand, her fingers disappearing into his massive palm, and confessed that his protective nature had healed the broken places inside her, the parts that had believed the town's thin standards and whispered judgments. He lifted her hand to his lips then, kissing her knuckles with a reverence that made tears prick at her eyes, and he said again the words that had started it all under that rainy porch. "You are worthy, Evelina. You always were, and would aim to spend every day proving it if you will let me." The afternoon brought the first real test of the new strength between them. They needed a few more supplies from town, things the homestead couldn't provide, before the trails grew too muddy with the coming rains, so they rode down together just after midday. Garrick kept his horse close to hers the whole way, one eye on the trail and the other on her, his massive frame a constant shield against whatever the territory might throw at them. As they entered Willow Creek, the whispers started immediately, louder than before, faces turning in doorways and hands covering mouths. Evelina felt the old familiar knot in her stomach, but Garrick's steady presence beside her kept it from taking root. They tied the horses outside the general store and stepped inside, his broad shoulders nearly brushing the doorframe as he held it open for her. The shopkeeper served them with tight lips, slamming packages down a little harder than necessary, but they paid him no mind, gathering flour and nails and a small packet of needles for her mending. Outside again, the trouble found them. A small crowd had gathered near the hitching post, led by Mrs. Hargrove herself and two of the sharper-tongued wives from the church circle. The women stood vacep arms crossed, their eyes flicking over Evelina's full figure in the calico dress with open disapproval. One of them, a thin woman with a pinched face, stepped forward and said loud enough for half the street to hear that it was a disgrace. A forsaken widow carrying on with a mountain giant twice her size, spending nights up in that cabin like some common hussy. The words cut sharp, and Evelina felt heat rise in her cheeks, the old doubts trying to creep back in. But Garrick moved before she could even draw breath. He stepped in front of her, his immense presence filling the space like a living wall, those storm-gray eyes calm but hard as flint. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. He simply said that the lady was with him, and they would all do well to keep their opinions where they belonged, in their own homes, and not on the street where decent folks walked. His size alone made the crowd shift back a step, but it was the quiet honor in his tone that silenced them more than any threat. Mrs. Hargrove opened her mouth to argue, but Garrick added soft and firm that Evelina had more strength and kindness in her little finger than the whole town put together, and he would thank them not to speak of her again unless it was vacep respect. The group muttered and dispersed, shooting dark looks over their shoulders, but the giant cowboy stood tall until they were gone, then turned to Evelina and cupped her face in one massive hand, with a gentleness that stole her breath. He searched her hazel eyes and asked if she was all right, his thumb brushing a stray tear from her cheek before it could fall. Evelina nodded, leaning into his touch, and told him the words had stung, but his defense had healed the hurt faster than any balm. She said she didn't care what they thought anymore, that being with him had shown her what real worth looked like. Garrick pulled her close right there on the boardwalk, his arms wrapping around her completely so her softer curves melted against his solid chest, and he kissed the top of her head right in front of anyone who cared to look. The moment felt bold and right, a public claim that said more than words ever could. They finished their errands in quiet solidarity. After that, Garrick carrying every heavy package without complaint, his free hand never far from hers as they walked back to the horses. The ride up the mountain that evening was slower, more thoughtful, the golden light of late afternoon painting the trail in warm hues that matched the warmth growing between them. Back at the cabin, as twilight settled soft over the valley, the confrontation in town lingered like a shadow, but could not dim the light they had kindled. Garrick built the fire high while Evelina prepared a hearty supper of venison stew and fresh cornbread, the domestic tasks feeling like a promise of all the evenings still to come. They ate at the table with the lamplight glowing on their faces, and after the plates were cleared, he took her hand and led her out to the porch, where the stars were beginning to wink overhead. The air had turned cooler, carrying the first bite of autumn, and he wrapped his heavy duster around them both again, pulling her back against his chest so she could feel the steady beat of his heart. They stood like that for a long time, his chin resting gently on the top of her head, her smaller frame fitting perfectly in the circle of his arms. The size difference made every embrace feel profound, his towering strength a living fortress, while her gentle presence softened the edges of his solitary life. He spoke then in that deep, rumbling voice she had come to love, telling her he had been thinking on this since the day the rain trapped them under that porch. He said the town could whisper and judge all it wanted, but he had found something rare and precious in her, a woman whose beauty ran soul deep and whose heart matched his in quiet resilience. Evelina turned in his arms to face him, tilting her head back so their eyes could meet in the starlight, and she whispered that she felt the same, that his protective honor had given her back the hope she thought the frontier had stolen. The words poured out of her then, all the fears and dreams she had carried across the plains, and he listened with that watchful intensity that made her feel truly heard. When she finished, he lowered his head and kissed her again, this time slower, deeper, his large hands cradling her face as if she were the most delicate thing in the territory. The kiss spoke of promises and futures, of winters spent together by the fire and springs filled with wildflowers they would tend side by side. When they finally pulled apart, foreheads touching, Garrick said quiet but certain that if she would have him, he wanted her to stay, to make the cabin their home, to build a life where neither of them ever had to face the hard days alone again. It wasn't a formal proposal with a ring or fancy words, but it was honest and real, the kind of vow a giant cowboy made when he knew down to his bones that he had found his match. Evelina's heart swelled until she thought it might burst. She told him yes, that she would stay, that there was nowhere else she wanted to be but here in this valley, with the man who had seen her worth when the rest of the world looked away. Tears slipped down her cheeks again, happy ones this time, and he wiped them away with his thumbs, his massive hands so careful they barely seemed to touch her skin. They talked long into the night after that, sitting wrapped together on the porch steps, planning small changes to the cabin and dreaming of the spring when they might stand before the preacher in town if the good Lord and the territory allowed. The town's judgment still loomed like a distant thunderhead, but in the shelter of each other's arms it felt small and far away. Garrick shared more of his past then, the fever that had taken his family and left him with nothing but the mountain and his hands, the long nights when the silence had nearly broken him. Evelina listened and offered her own stories in return. The loss of her first husband and the desperate letters that had brought her west, the way she had started to believe she would never be enough. Each confession knit them closer, the emotional healing flowing both ways like the creek after rain, his protectiveness giving her courage and her gentle strength reminding him that love could grow even in the hardest soil. Later, when the chill drove them inside, Garrick insisted she take the big bed once more while he made his pallet by the fire. But this time she shook her head and pulled him down beside her on the wide mattress built for a man his size. There was no impropriety in it, only the deep trust they had earned through every shared storm and tender day. He lay careful on his back so she could curl against his side, her head on his broad chest and one of his massive arms wrapped around her, holding her close without crushing. The size difference made the moment feel sacred, his powerful body a warm shield against the night, while her softer curves fit perfectly into the spaces he left for her. They fell asleep like that, breathing in rhythm, the fire crackling low and the valley quiet outside the windows. Evelina dreamed of a future where the whispers no longer mattered, where the giant cowboy and the forsaken widow had built something lasting and true. Morning came with a pale autumn sun filtering through the pines, and they rose to a new kind of peace. Garrick made coffee while Evelina prepared breakfast, their movements easy and familiar now, brushing hands and exchanging soft smiles as if they had been doing this for years. They rode down to town together again later that day, this time to speak with the preacher about the possibility of a simple ceremony before winter set in hard. The gossip still followed them, sharper glances and muttered words. But Garrick's protective arm around her shoulders and the quiet certainty in his stride made it all roll off like rain on oiled canvas. At the church, an older man with kind eyes listened to their story and agreed to perform the service in 2 weeks if they still felt the same. Evelina's heart soared at the words, and Garrick squeezed her hand tight, his storm-gray eyes shining with a joy she had never seen in them before. On the way back up the mountain, a sudden gust of wind whipped through the valley, carrying the sharp scent of an approaching storm. Dark clouds rolled in faster than expected, and Garrick urged the horses to a quicker pace, his protective instincts flaring as he kept his mount between hers and the rising wind. Fat drops began to fall just as they reached the cabin, and he swept her down from the saddle in one smooth motion, carrying her inside out of the rain like he had done that very first day. Inside, safe and dry, he set her down and pulled her close again, laughing low at how the weather seemed determined to remind them of how they had begun. Evelina laughed, vekep him, her arms around his waist as far as they could reach, and they stood there holding Iagzahat other while the storm raged outside, thunder rolling across the peaks. The sound echoed the steady beat of his heart under her ear, and she knew without doubt that this was where she belonged, in the arms of the giant cowboy who had taught her she was worthy from the very first rain-soaked confession. The week that followed was filled with quiet preparations and deeper conversations, the bond between them strengthening with every shared task and tender touch. Garrick worked on the cabin, adding shelves for her few precious books from back east, while Evelina baked and mended and planned the simple life they would share. Town gossip continued to swirl, but the confrontations had lost their sting because they faced them together. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the valley in fiery colors, Garrick turned to her and said the words she had waited her whole life to hear in that deep, honest voice. "Mot love you, Evelina. Have from the moment Mot saw you standing in the rain, strong and beautiful in a way no thin standard could ever touch." She answered back without hesitation, her hazel eyes shining, that she loved him too, that his strength and honor had healed her, and her gentle heart had given him back the hope he thought lost. They kissed then under the fading light, slow and full of promise, the giant cowboy and the forsaken widow no longer two lonely souls, but two hearts beating as one against the vast frontier sky. Yet, even in the warmth of that growing love, the territory had one more shadow to cast before their story could truly settle. As the days drew closer to the planned ceremony, Word reached them through a passing rider that some of the rougher men in Willow Creek had taken the gossip further, talking of riding up to the mountain to teach the mountain giant a lesson about taking what didn't belong in their town. Garrick listened to the news with a calm that belied the protective fire in his eyes, and he told Evelina not to worry, that he would keep her safe no matter what came. She believed him, her hand resting on his broad chest where his heartbeat stayed steady and sure. That night they sat closer than ever by the fire, talking through the possibilities, her resilience meeting his strength in a way that made them both stronger. The storm clouds of doubt and judgment were gathering once more, but the love they had built in the quiet days and rainy nights felt deep enough to weather anything the Wild West could throw at them. Evelina curled against him as sleep came, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together, the giant cowboy's protective arms around the woman he had declared worthy from the very first moment, their hearts entwined in a slow burn romance that had healed them both and promised a future brighter than any Montana sunrise. The final week before the simple ceremony the preacher had agreed to perform up at the homestead stretched out like a slow golden thread under the Montana sky, sweet with anticipation yet edged with the gathering shadows of those rough men from Willow Creek whose whispers had turned to threats. Garrick kept his storm-gray eyes sharper than ever on the trail leading down to town, his massive frame moving with quiet purpose as he checked the corral fences twice a day and kept his old rifle cleaned and ready though he prayed he would never need it. Evelina stayed close to the cabin, her full, soft figure moving through the garden and the kitchen with a new steadiness born of the love that had healed her, pinning her lush chestnut hair back with quiet determination in a shea hat morning, and baking bread that filled the valley with the warm scent of home. They spoke of the wedding in low voices by the fire at night, her smaller hand tucked into his massive one, and he told her soft that no matter what came, he would stand between her and any storm the territory tried to send. She believed him, her hazel eyes shining with the resilience that had drawn him to her from the very first rainy afternoon under that narrow porch. And she reminded him in return that his protective heart had already proven she was worthy of every gentle promise he had ever made. The trouble arrived on a crisp evening 2 days before the ceremony, the kind of twilight that painted the pines in deep purple and gold while the first stars pricked the sky. Garrick and Evelina were sitting on the porch after supper, his long duster wrapped around them both against the cooling air, her head resting against the solid wall of his chest as they watched the valley settle for the night. The sound of horses coming up the trail cut through the quiet like a warning, and Garrick stood slow and tall, his 6'8" frame unfolding like a mountain rising from the earth itself. He positioned himself in front of her without a word, broad shoulders squared and those calloused hands loose at his sides, ready but never eager for violence. Evelina rose beside him, her smaller frame steady despite the flutter in her chest, and she placed one hand lightly on his arm, showing him without words that she stood with him. 4 riders crested the rise, rough men from the saloon in town, their faces hard with drink and the kind of small-minded anger that came from a life spent measuring others by thin standards that had never fit the real world. The leader, a wiry man with a scar across one cheek, reined in hard and spat on the ground, calling out that they had come to set things right, that a forsaken widow like her had no business latching onto a mountain giant and turning the town's good name into gossip. He sneered that a woman of her size and past belonged in the boarding house or back on the stage east, not here pretending she could make a home with a man built like a bear. The others muttered agreement, their horses shifting restless in the fading light. Garrick's voice rolled out deep and calm as thunder over the prairie, never rising but carrying the weight of every honorable mile he had walked in this territory. He told them plain that the lady was his intended, that she had come west with hope and found something real, and that he would thank them to turn around and ride back down before the night grew any darker. His storm-gray eyes never wavered, his massive presence alone making the horses sidestep nervous. But he kept his hands open and his stance protective rather than aggressive, the giant cowboy choosing honor over force even when every muscle in his powerful body stood ready. Evelina stepped forward then, her voice quiet but clear with that gentle eastern lilt, telling the men that she had once believed the whispers too, that she had arrived forsaken and broken. But this man had shown her different, had seen her worth when the town only saw what didn't fit their narrow view. She said she was staying, that love had healed them both, and that no amount of threats could change the truth they had built together under this very sky. The leader laughed harsh, raising a hand as if to spur his horse closer, but Garrick moved then, One powerful step forward that made the earth seem to shift beneath him, his broad shoulders blocking Evelina completely from view. He didn't draw a weapon, didn't shout. He simply looked the man dead in the eye and said low and certain that if they wanted to test him, they could try. But they would be answering to more than just one giant cowboy. They would be answering to the peace he had earned on this land, and the woman whose heart had taught him that strength came in many forms. The size difference between him and the riders made the moment stark, his towering frame casting long shadows that swallowed their smaller ones, and something in his quiet authority, the raw honor rolling off him like heat from the hearth, made the men hesitate. One by one, their horses backed up, the leader muttering curses under his breath but turning his mount anyway, the group disappearing down the trail into the gathering dark, with the echo of Garrick's words still hanging in the air. Evelina let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding and stepped into his arms the moment they were alone, her softer curves melting against the hard wall of his chest as he wrapped her up completely, his massive hands gentle on her back. He whispered into her hair that it was over, that no one would ever make her feel unworthy again, and she answered by rising on her toes to kiss him, slow and deep and full of the love that had grown from that first shared shelter in the rain. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and bright, the kind of autumn day that made the valley glow like it had been blessed just for them. Garrick rose early, stoking the fire and preparing a simple breakfast of eggs from the coop and fresh coffee. His movements careful and full of quiet joy as he watched Evelina pin her chestnut hair in a soft updo and smooth the modest calico dress she had freshened with a bit of lace from her carpetbag. He had ridden down the day before to fetch the preacher, an older man with kind eyes and a worn Bible, and now the three of them stood together on the porch, as the sun climbed higher, the creek murmuring its blessing in the background, and the pines standing sentinel like old friends. There were no grand guests, no fancy flowers or veils, just the honest frontier truth of two souls who had found each other against all odds. The preacher spoke the words, slow and reverent, joining their hands right there where the giant cowboy had first draped his coat round the forsaken widow's shoulders weeks earlier. Garrick looked down at Evelina, his storm-gray eyes soft with everything he had held back until this moment, and when it came time for his vow, he spoke from the heart in that deep, rumbling voice that had always made her feel safe. He said he took her as his wife, to protect and cherish through every storm and every clear day, to remind her every morning that she was worthy, more worthy than any thin standard the world could ever set, that her gentle strength and full-hearted beauty had healed the lonely places inside him and given him a home he had never known he needed. Evelina's voice trembled only a little as she answered, promising to stand beside him, to tend their valley and their life with the resilience she had found in his arms, to love the giant of a man who had seen past her past and her softer figure to the woman she truly was. The preacher pronounced them man and wife under the big Montana sky, and Garrick bent to kiss her then, lifting her clear off the ground in one effortless motion so her feet dangled and her arms wrapped around his neck, the size difference making the kiss feel like the whole world had narrowed to just the two of them, warm and safe and forever. After the simple words and the preacher's quiet congratulations, the three of them shared a meal on the porch, venison stew and fresh bread and the last of the summer berries, laughter coming easy now that the threats had faded into the past like morning mist. The old man rode back down the trail before dusk, leaving them alone in their new life, and Garrick carried Evelina across the threshold of the cabin the way a man his size could, her smaller frame cradled against his broad chest like she belonged there always. That night they lay together in the wide bed he had built with his own hands, the fire crackling low and the valley quiet outside the windows, his massive arm wrapped around her as she curled into his side, her head tucked beneath his chin and her soft curves fitting perfectly into the spaces his powerful body left for her. He whispered against her hair that this was only the beginning, that winters would come and go, but they would face them side by side, that he would keep protecting her gentle heart, and she would keep healing his lonely one, until the good Lord called them home. Evelina smiled in the firelight, tracing the line of his jaw with her fingers, and told him she had never felt more worthy, more loved, more at home than she did right here in the arms of her giant cowboy. The months that followed wove their love deeper into the fabric of the land itself. Winter arrived with its deep snows and howling winds, but the cabin stayed warm and full of life, Evelina baking bread by the hearth, while Garrick split wood and tended the animals, his powerful frame cutting through the drifts like the mountain man he was. She taught him to read more of the books she had carried west, and he showed her how to gentle the new foals born in the spring, his large hands moving with surprising tenderness while she watched with quiet pride. The town's whispers eventually faded, replaced by a grudging respect when folks saw how the giant cowboy and his wife had turned the remote homestead into a place of quiet plenty, the garden flourishing under her care and the cattle herd growing strong under his. Word spread of the honorable mountain man who had chosen a woman the territory had once called forsaken, and slowly neighbors began riding up the trail with small gifts and offers of help, drawn by the story of a love that had bloomed from rain and courage. Evelina's figure softened further with the coming of their first child the following summer, her belly rounding gentle and full, and Garrick's protectiveness only deepened, his hands resting light on her curves as he helped her walk the valley paths, whispering that she had never looked more beautiful, never been more worthy of the life they were building together. Years slipped by in the easy rhythm of frontier days, the cabin gaining rooms as their family grew, little ones with their mother's hazel eyes, and their father's quiet strength running through the wildflowers each spring. Evelina stood on the porch many evenings watching her giant of a husband lift their children high on his broad shoulders, laughter echoing across the valley, while she felt the deep healing that had come full circle, her once broken heart now whole and overflowing. Garrick never stopped reminding her in small ways and big ones that she was worthy, draping his coat around her shoulders on rainy days just like the first time, kissing her freckled nose and telling her the town's thin standards had never measured up to the woman who had saved him from a lifetime of silence. Their love remained a slow burn flame, tender and fierce all at once, the dramatic size difference between them only making every embrace sweeter, every protective gesture more profound, every healing word more lasting. The forsaken widow who had stepped off the stage, Vikep Butehat nothing but hope had become the heart of a mountain home, and the giant cowboy who had carried the weight of loss alone now walked tall beside the woman who had taught him that true strength came from opening his heart. And so, friends, in the rugged beauty of the Montana territory where rain could trap two souls under a narrow porch and change everything forever, Garrick and Evelina proved that love doesn't follow the world's rules or the town's thin standards. It finds the unexpected, the resilient, the quietly strong, and it heals what the frontier tries hardest to break. The giant cowboy's protective arms and the forsaken widow's gentle heart wove together a story of worthiness that echoes down through every Western romance worth telling, reminding us all that sometimes the greatest beauty hides in the places others overlook, and that a single confession shared in the rain can lead to a lifetime of shelter, hope, and a love bigger than the mountains themselves. This is why we keep spinning these tales here on Cowboy Ironheart, because in a world that still whispers judgments, stories like this one light the way back to what truly matters, two hearts finding home in each other against all odds. This is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment and educational purposes. The characters, events, and situations in this story are entirely imaginary. Any resemblance to real people or real events is purely coincidental. This content was created with the aid of AI tools and has been carefully edited by the team at Cowboy Ironheart. All rights reserved.